House of Representatives, Honorable Femi Gbajabiamila has said that the House will authorize legal funding for Nigerians who are victims of the recent xenophobic attacks in South Africa and wish to institute legal actions against the perpetrators. The Speaker revealed this at a press briefing on the xenophobic attacks in the country. Over 180 persons have been arrested on the wake of reprisal targeting South Africans' interest in the country, with some groups stepping in the fray, asking for the release of those that are arrested here in Nigeria. But what does this mean to the people's biggest economies on the African continent? We'll have to look at the bilateral relations between them. What if the violence escalates despite an envoy sent to South Africa at the instance of President Muhammadu Buhari? We'll focus on that as well on the show today. Data feeds are coming through in one place simultaneously on all our social media platforms, on channelstv.com and on youtube.com/channelsweb, where you can find our videos as well. Follow us live on m.channelstv.com and on Facebook as well. We've got all our social media platforms covered. Be part of the show. Tweet at Gimba Umar CTV. Use the hashtag State of the Nation. Let's get your thoughts in on the subject. It's prime time here in Lagos, and this is State of the Nation. On a rather sad note on State of the Nation, recognizing the transition to greater glory of Zimbabwe's former president, Robert Mugabe. He was 95 years old. Reactions are pouring in from world leaders and statesmen, one of whom is former President Chief Olusegun Obasanjo. In a letter made available to reporters on Friday by his media assistant, Kehinde Akinyemi, former President Obasanjo condoled with the government and people of Zimbabwe over the loss of their former leader. The former president noted that Zimbabwean President Emerson Mnangagwa announced that the non-Nigerian died in the early hours of September the 6th in Singapore. He described the late Zimbabwean leader as an indomitable fighter who contributed in no small measure to the liberation of his country from the era of apartheid and oppressive radicalism. Let's get into the main discussion now for today. We'll not be giving in to on this occasion. The Minister of Foreign Affairs, Geoffrey Onyema, has revealed that Nigeria's position on alleged xenophobic attacks against mostly Nigerians in South Africa. And he also said that Nigeria would not be severing ties with South Africa. Nationalized South African businesses in Nigeria, says Adam Soshomole, the chairman of the APC. He made a call at the end of an emergency National Working Committee meeting of the ruling party in Abuja, the nation's capital. But in order to send a very strong message to South African authorities and the South African people, it is worth it for the Nigerian government to take steps to take over the remaining shares of MTN that are owned by South Africans so that MTN becomes fully Nigerian owned. Those are indeed words again from the APC chairman. If Nigeria decides at least for the next 30 days to stop using MTN, they would have sent a clear message. That's according to him. To analyze this further, I'm now being joined by Chris Isike. He's a professor of African politics and development, University of Pretoria. He joins us from South Africa. Also joining us from our Abuja studios is Mr. Bamidele. I want to thank you so much as well for joining us from our Abuja studios. Let's begin with you, Professor Isike. You live in South Africa for quite some time now. Why has these killings and attacks on foreigners, migrants if you will, to South Africa, why has it persisted to this time?
Good evening, and good evening to my friends. Well, for me, there are a number of factors that contribute to these claims and their persistence. Like I said a few days ago, for me, it has to do with the failure of the government of South Africa in 1994 to educate and raise awareness, prepare their populace for the inflow of migrants from all over the world, including Africans. Especially in terms of the fact that these migrants, especially those from Africa, contributed immensely, to the struggle against apartheid, in the 80s and 90s. The failure to do that has kind of become a shock to South Africans, especially the Africans among them. When I say Africans, I mean the colored skinned people, about the fact that they see African migrants coming in as an invasion of their spaces, especially given the perceived or imagined cultural differences between them. So that is one. And then also there's the economic angle to all of this. The South African government inherited a legacy of poverty and inequality of service delivery dichotomies between the European and African populations. And the government of South Africa has been grappling with, trying to meet, the gap in terms of these, service delivery dichotomies. They've not been able to do that, largely for many reasons, including, inept governance and corruption. And then there's also where they're doing well enough. There are service delivery challenges that make locals feel that government is not doing enough, and that the foreign migrants, especially from Africa, are competing for economic spaces with them. Now, this has been exacerbated by the very reckless comments by political leaders and leaders of thought in the country, including those in the traditional leadership, those in government. You have ministers, you have people in parliament, mayors and premiers of regions, blaming African migrants for service delivery shortages and challenges in the health sector, in the education sector, in the construction industry. So these kinds of comments, and even in the media, interestingly, these kinds of comments have actually, in my view, incited the kind of loathing, the kind of hatred that has, in my view, spurred the attack, as well as the criminality.
Okay, Prof. You said it's hatred that has, triggered this kinds of attacks that we're seeing in South Africa. But the president, he did make a statement earlier today, President Cyril Ramaphosa, and in his broadcast, he was trying to calm frayed nerves. Do you think that his actions will douse tensions in South Africa such that we do not record any killings or attacks, even as we speak?
Well, his statements, they are helpful. He's giving two in the last 3 days. They are helpful, but the problem is that if it is not followed up by action against perpetrators, by commitment to creating a conducive environment for migrants to stay, by, for example, making moves to compensate those who have lost their livelihoods, then it will happen in a year or two from now. These kinds of talks have been given in the past, and there's not been any kind of commitment. Like I said before, people are usually arrested. We hear that, according to the president, over 420 people have been, arrested in the last week over these issues. But the question would then be, what happens to them? Are they prosecuted, or they get released after a few days and then they get back to society and then do the same thing in a year from now?
Let's bring this to our Abuja studios now, and we're now being joined by Mr. Onoja Adagbo, who is the lecturer at Veritas University in Abuja. I want to thank you so much indeed also for joining us on State of the Nation. This is what we know. The President, Muhammadu Buhari, has sent an envoy to meet with the South African president in South Africa, after which a detailed report is expected to be submitted to Mr. President. It will seem to suggest that this time around, the government is not taking it lightly with the South African authorities. When you look at this, would you say that is the case?
I wouldn't say that's the case, because we ought to have had that long before now, because the story of killings, molestations have been consistent in coming. And once anything affects citizens outside the shores of Nigeria, it ought to have been a priority subject for the government of Nigeria. Waiting until the escalation before sending a special envoy looks to me like a fire brigade approach. I don't know how adequate or what a special envoy is going to add to the situation that the foreign minister could not have handled through the mission in South Africa.
Well, as it stands now, we're expecting that report as soon as the envoy gets back to the country. You believe that this is an exercise in futility. Am I getting that right?
Well, it might not be an exercise in futility. Whether it can add value and what sort of value is the question. I mean, the killings have taken place, or the molestations have taken place, the protests, the mass riots, and the responses at all levels. The two things have happened. First of all, blacks on black violence has occurred. The first thing there is that it undermines the negotiating power of the black world. Because if you are fighting among yourselves, what do you tell others about yourselves? That's one. So it undermines, it complicates the African condition. The second thing is that it has interrogated the whole effort in terms of building a cooperative, solid cooperative relationship between Nigeria and South Africa.
Would you rather?
That so many people have.
Yes, go ahead, please.
Yeah, people have worked on that to bring it to the level it was before the current crisis. Why does anybody allow that sort of effort to be wasted? Because even if you mend fences now, you are going to start afresh. So it might not be an exercise in futility, but it's confronting a massive problem that I'm not sure what we are going to get at the end of the day from that mission.
What kind of problems do you think exists? Because it seems to suggest to a lot of people who have been watching this so many wanton killings over the years now, what problem do you think exists in the South African society such that people feel so aggrieved and would want to attack foreigners? Because the narrative we hear is that the foreigners are taking over your jobs.
Well, we have to, yeah, I think the South Africans have been consistent on that. The police, deputy police commissioner, whose video has gone viral, and then the foreign minister, they have all said the problem is that the foreigners have introduced drug into the South African society, and of course, they are more prosperous. Normally, foreigners and settlers are more prosperous. So that's one problem. From their narratives. And the second one is that Nigerians are usually very assertive wherever they are. And when they come together, the assertiveness can get on the nerves of the natives, of the host community. All these are understandable. The issue is, are we hearing that the ANC had no mechanism, had no intelligence, has no political departments, has no sources of perceiving or policing tendencies in terms of intergroup relations in South Africa? How could the South African state not have perceived this, not have anticipated this, not have known about this to the point that it will reach an escalatory level that it has reached now? It's made more complicated when we have citizens like Trevor Noah, like Julius Malema, who have been on this issue long before now, who've been warning, who've been conscientizing their people, who've been mobilizing against a situation whereby blacks will be attacking blacks. Okay. I think so. That's a big question. So if the South African authorities did not know, the ANC, which is our model in terms of an African political party, did not know, and the Nigerian government also did not know, It's not possible. Something is playing somewhere.
All right. We'll look at the possibilities
this sort
of them knowing or not when we return after this break. But we're still analyzing the attacks on foreigners in South Africa condemned by leaders in Nigeria and in Zimbabwe. We'll be right back after these messages. Join us again. Nigeria should galvanize the African continent to completely end genocide in South Africa. The African Renaissance will continue to remain a mirage if hate is allowed to foster unabated in Africa. There has been one killing too many, and now is the time for African leaders to frontally confront this deadly scourge called xenophobia. The constant killings in South Africa is condemnable, and this latest act of xenophobic attacks on Nigerians and other nationals by South Africans with the tacit support of government is barbaric and callous. All these were revealed in a statement by the Young Progressives Party, the YPP, and signed by its National Publicity Secretary, Comrade Egbeola Wale. Now let's get kicking again. Professor Chris, you have by and large understood the dynamics that we see play out in South Africa, being a professor in a university there. But when you listen to some of the views and concerns that have been raised here in Nigeria, for instance, the APC chairman, Mr. Adams Oshomole, did say that we should push forward for a government that will nationalize South African businesses in Nigeria. Do you think that that will solve the problem?
I don't know if you can maybe give a little response in terms of what the other panelists were saying about the migrant-host relationships. Just to explain something about why it's not just xenophobia, it's Afrophobia, and a possible causal factor that can help us understand why Africans in South Africa tend to target only Africans from the continent. Am I able to just butt in a bit and answer that quickly before I answer your question, or should you want to just go straight?
Go ahead, then we can return to the question.
Great. Everything you said is spot on, it's correct, brilliant analysis. But the question for me would be, typically, like you said, when migrants and their hosts meet, usually, like you said, migrants, because of their position, tend to do better. It's not just peculiar to South Africa, it's everywhere in the world. But now, in the case of South Africa, that would have been a logical explanation if, the attacks against foreigners, the frustrations that lead to those attacks were targeted at all foreigners, including Asians, including Europeans, okay? In this case, it's targeted at only Africans. So it raises the question of why. And that's why I like to see this as Afrophobia rather than xenophobia, because it's targeted at just Africans alone. Now, there are studies that show that the dynamics of apartheid group relations, and its psychosocial effect led, for example, to self-loathing, in the context between the established groups, which is the European, and then the outsider group, which was the African population at the time, led to a cultural persecution, economic deprivations that dehumanized, the African then. And this dehumanization, has continued to play out to a point where it amounts to self-hate, like even Julius Malema himself, the president of the EFF, has admitted. So that by the time the apartheid era ended, what you find is that the previous outsider group have now become the established group. And naturally, to validate themselves, they look for anything that looks like them and begin to hate that object. And African immigrants who look exactly like them, even sometimes even culturally similar to them, become easy targets. And like I said before, the rhetoric and the speeches of politicians and other political top leaders within society tending to blame African immigrants for governance failure have tended to then reinforce those kinds of self-loathing that even make them feel that they are exceptionally good. So I just want us to have that understanding of why is it targeted at only Africans alone.
Okay, so in trying to solve these problems, as I did ask you the question earlier, that was a recommendation, if you will, by the chairman of the APC, that maybe some of these businesses belonging to South Africans should be, given back to Nigerians, and as a way of making a very strong statement to the South African people.
Well, I don't think nationalizing their businesses in Nigeria will solve the problem. For me, it is one other way we lose the moral advantage we have, of course, until Nigerians themselves started looting their businesses in Nigeria. Until then, we had a moral advantage in terms of taking this to the international community and trying to rally some kind of support and intervention. Nationalizing the businesses could be seen as, appropriating, and can negate a lot of international agreements, which will put us in very negative light. In my view, there are other channels, diplomatic channels, that will be equally effective in hurting the South African economy and forcing them, to do what we want them to do in terms of, for example, treating Nigerians better, in terms of, paying compensation to all those who have lost their lives. So I agree with the APC chairman that we could target blocking repatriation of funds, of profits made by MTN, made by Stanbic Bank, made by DSTV. Those funds can be blocked. To say we're not taking your property, we're not taking yours. We're just simply saying we're going to hold on to this until you pay compensation to all Nigerians who have lost, their livelihoods and be displaced as a result of those senseless attacks. That's one. You can also block importation with those, but nationalizing their businesses could amount to, for lack of a better word, amount to taking what's not yours.
Okay. Let me come in here again and ask Mr. Adagbo on this in our Abuja studios. Now, we recently, as a country, signed onto the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. That's the AfCFTA, as a way of fostering, trade relations within the continent. But what does that portend now that Africa, being headed by Nigeria, if you will, and South Africa as the biggest economies on the continent, what does this mean to the African continent when you have to juxtapose that with the AfCFTA?
No, I don't think anything fundamental has happened that will threaten the AfCFTA. I think what we need to do is to look back and see where the problem arose and what should be done to plug it in. I mean, it's not that conflicts don't happen. It's not so strange that you have this violence, although it ought not to have come from South Africa, but then it has come. But it can be put back. We cannot plan yesterday, but we can plan tomorrow. And what it needs to be done is to plan. The problem is, have we got people who want to plan? And on what paradigms? I mean, Comrade Oshiomhole is suggesting nationalization. I believe he has read or is conversant with what Bolaji Akinyemi wrote when he was leaving the Director Generalship of the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs. All that the bourgeoisie in Nigeria needs to do or needed to have been doing is outlined in that speech. Have they read it? Why do you want to nationalize when you are already in the middle of crisis? Nigeria itself is not free of crisis. Nigeria is in crisis. South Africa is in crisis. It's not specific to them. It's the crisis of global capitalism at this level, but also Nigeria has its own share of them. South Africa has its own share of them. So the idea of jumping into rhetorical excesses will not help us in terms of how to resolve this. I stand by my argument that nothing fundamental has happened that threatens the Africa as a free trade zone. What needs to be done is to put in place certain mechanisms very quickly, but one of them is not nationalization.
Professor Isike, just very quickly before we let you go, do you believe that going by these unfolding scenarios, we have heard repeatedly that Nigerians are criminals in South Africa? Could you just lend a voice on that? Is that truly the case? Are Nigerians really that terrible, doing terrible stuff against the government and the laws of South Africa?
You like every people have their criminal element. So Nigeria, South Africa are not exception. Okay, I've said in several fora that for every one drug peddler you have, a Nigerian drug peddler you have in South Africa, you're going to find 3 professors in South African universities. You're going to find 10 medical doctors in South African hospitals saving lives, teaching their children in high schools, at university level. Business people contributing significantly, to the economy and development of the country. But because bad news sells, then people tend to relate more with the negativity. So it's a fact that there are Nigerians who are engaged in crime, in drug peddling. They are also engaged in prostitution businesses. They used to be heavily involved.
But the bigger picture, my apologies, but the bigger picture is that there are Nigerians who are legitimately doing their businesses in South Africa as in other parts of the world. I must sincerely thank you, Professor Chris Isike, Professor of African Politics and Development, University of Pretoria. Many thanks indeed for talking to us on State of the Nation, as well as Mr. Onoja Adagbo, who's a lecturer at Veritas University in Abuja. Thank you both, gentlemen, for talking to us on State of the Nation, and to you for being a part of it. Many thanks indeed for watching. I'm Gimba Umar. Have a splendid weekend. Bye for now.